The Unveiled Fortune, Chapter 1. The Wedding of Gilded Promises. The Arizona sun, usually a benevolent golden presence, felt like a scorching spotlight on Eleanor. 65 years had etched fine lines around her eyes, but her gaze, though often understated, held a quiet, watchful intelligence. She sat in a rented pew at the opulent Scottsdale resort, a silent observer at her son David's wedding. David, her only son, now 40, stood at the altar, impeccably tailored, his handsome face radiating a self-satisfied glow. Beside him, his bride, Sophia, 38, was a vision in designer lace, her beauty sharp, almost predatory. Sophia was from old money, or so she claimed, and her disdain for Eleanor's quiet life and modest home in the Arizona suburbs was palpable, often expressed with thinly veiled contempt. Eleanor had always lived simply. Her husband Robert, a successful but private businessman, had instilled in her a sense of thrift and modesty. He often spoke of living within their means, of avoiding ostentation. Their house was comfortable, but certainly not grand. David, however, had always been different. Robert, despite his own frugality, had indulged their son, showering him with the latest gadgets, expensive clothes, and private school education. David had grown accustomed to luxury, his sense of entitlement blossoming with each passing year. After Robert's sudden passing a year ago, David had handled the estate. He had informed Eleanor, with a shrug, that Robert had been a bit eccentric with his finances. The inheritance was modest: the house, a small life insurance policy, and a few investment accounts. "Dad always was a bit of a penny pincher, wasn't he, Mom?" David had said, dismissing the lack of a grand fortune. Eleanor, though surprised, had accepted it. Robert was a good man, a loving husband, and she trusted his judgment. But now at this lavish wedding, paid for by David with what he believed was his inheritance, Eleanor felt an unsettling undercurrent. Sophia had made it clear, through pointed remarks about Eleanor's sensible dress and her quaint little house, that she considered her mother-in-law a relic from a less sophisticated time. During the reception, as the champagne flowed and the band played a loud, generic pop song, Sophia approached Eleanor's table. A saccharine smile plastered on her face. Her voice, however, was laced with thinly veiled malice. "Eleanor, darling, isn't this just divine? David spared no expense. Of course it's not quite what I'm used to, but for his budget, it's quite commendable." She glanced at Eleanor's simple pearl necklace, a gift for Robert on their 30th anniversary. "Such quaint taste, dear. But then, not everyone is blessed with an eye for true luxury, are they?" Eleanor's grip tightened on her champagne flute. She met Sophia's gaze, her own eyes betraying nothing of the quiet fury simmering beneath her composed exterior. David, standing nearby, chuckled, not bothering to intervene. Thank goodness, Eleanor thought, a profound sense of relief washing over her. Thank goodness I didn't say a word. Because Eleanor, the unassuming widow in the sensible dress, was sitting on a secret so monumental it would shatter David and Sophia's carefully constructed world. A secret that would make Sophia's condescending remarks shrivel into nothingness. Robert hadn't been a penny pincher. He had been a man of immense wealth, a multi-millionaire, and he had left it all to Eleanor. $7 million, a fortune that no one, not David, not Sophia, not even their closest friends, knew existed. And at this moment, watching her son's casual dismissal and her new daughter-in-law's open contempt, Eleanor thanked God she had kept her silence. The revelation would come, not with a celebratory toast, but with a quiet, calculated vengeance. The wedding of gilded promises would soon reveal a truth far more precious than gold. Chapter 2. Robert's Shadows. The memory of Sophia's condescension lingered long after the wedding guests had departed. Back in her quiet, unassuming home, Eleanor felt the echoes of their dismissive laughter. But beneath the sting of their disdain, a new resolve hardened within her. She was thankful for her silence, profoundly so. Her mind drifted back to Robert, her steadfast, loving husband, a successful civil engineer. He had always provided well for their family. Their life had been comfortable, never extravagant. He drove a sensible car, wore off-the-rack suits, and preferred quiet evenings at home to lavish parties. He always preached the value of hard work, saving, and avoiding debt. He spoke of modest investments and future security. Eleanor had respected his prudence, believing it to be the bedrock of their stable, happy life. But now, the image of Robert, the penny pincher in David's eyes, seemed to shimmer, revealing a hidden depth. Why had he lived so humbly if he possessed such a vast fortune? Why had he kept it a secret, even from her, until his death? And why had David, their spoiled, entitled son, been left with so little? A vivid flashback assaulted her. David, at 16, demanding a brand new sports car for his birthday. Robert, usually so firm, had caved, buying him the car despite Eleanor's protests. "He's a good boy, Eleanor," Robert had said, though his eyes held a flicker of doubt. "He deserves it." But then David had crashed the car a month later, carelessly, and shown little remorse. Robert had simply sighed and bought him another. This pattern repeated throughout David's youth. Expensive toys, lavish allowances, always indulgence, rarely consequences. Eleanor now saw the paradox. Robert, the frugal millionaire, indulging David, the entitled son. It didn't quite fit. There had to be a deeper reason for Robert's financial secrecy, something more profound than mere eccentricity. The day after the wedding, Eleanor placed a call to Mr. Harrison, their family attorney. Mr. Harrison was a man of integrity, discreet and unfailingly kind. He had handled Robert's estate quietly and efficiently. "Mr. Harrison," Eleanor began, her voice steady, "I need to discuss Robert's will. Specifically, the part that concerns me." There was a slight pause on the other end of the line. "Of course, Eleanor. Come to my office this afternoon." His tone suggested a knowing understanding, a hint that he anticipated this conversation. Eleanor dressed carefully, choosing a simple, dark blue dress, the kind Sophia would dismiss as drab. She wanted clarity, not ostentation. At Mr. Harrison's office, the air was hushed and formal. He gestured for her to sit, his expression sympathetic. "Eleanor," he began, placing a thick file on his desk. Robert made it very clear that certain aspects of his estate were to remain confidential until after his passing, and only to be disclosed to you, and only at your discretion. He opened the file. Robert Miller, he said, his voice measured, was not simply a successful engineer. He was, in fact, a multi-millionaire. His net worth, at the time of his passing, exceeded $7 million. Eleanor felt a wave of shock, despite knowing the truth already. Hearing it confirmed, officially, from Mr. Harrison, still sent a jolt through her. $7 million. But why? Eleanor whispered, the word barely audible. Why did he hide it? Why did he live so simply? And why did David inherit so little? Mr. Harrison leaned forward, his voice dropping slightly. Robert had a very specific reason, Eleanor, a painful one. Early in his career, before you met him, he had a business partnership, a lucrative one, or so he thought. His partners were flashy, extravagant, and ultimately deceitful. They embezzled funds, ran the company into the ground, and left Robert nearly bankrupt, facing significant legal challenges. He lost everything he had, and then some. It taught him a profound lesson about the dangers of visible wealth and the kind of people it attracts. He paused, letting the weight of the revelations settle. He vowed then that if he ever rebuilt his fortune, he would do so quietly, secretly. He believed that true security lay in anonymity, in living below one's means, regardless of how much one had. He wanted to protect you and David from the very kind of predatory individuals he had encountered. Eleanor listened, a dawning understanding spreading through her. Robert had been traumatized by his past. His frugality wasn't eccentricity. It was a deeply ingrained survival mechanism, a silent vow to protect his family. "And David?" Eleanor asked, the raw ache of unanswered questions in her voice. Mr. Harrison sighed. Robert loved David deeply, Eleanor, but he also saw his son's inclinations, his desire for instant gratification, his taste for luxury, his tendency towards entitlement. Robert became increasingly concerned that if David inherited a large sum of money without understanding its true value or the effort required to earn it, it would destroy him. He saw how money had corrupted his former partners, and he feared it would do the same to David. He pushed a document across the desk. Robert specifically stipulated that David would inherit a comfortable sum, enough to provide for himself, but not enough to indulge in reckless extravagance. The bulk of his fortune, Eleanor, the $7 million, was bequeathed entirely to you, with the explicit instruction that you were to manage it as you saw fit, for the betterment of your life, and, if you chose, for philanthropic purposes. He wanted you to have true security and the power to use his wealth wisely, perhaps to teach David a lesson he could not learn through indulgence. Eleanor stared at the document, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't a betrayal. It was an act of profound, agonizing love. Robert had protected her, provided for her, and in his death, given her the means to protect their son from himself. The silent burden he had carried, the true meaning of his frugality, now lay exposed. And in that moment, Eleanor understood. The wisdom of his decision, the profound foresight he had shown, was startling. And she knew, with chilling clarity, that David and Sophia, with their insatiable appetites for wealth and status, were about to learn a lesson far more valuable than any inheritance. Chapter 3: The Gilded Cage. The revelation from Mr. Harrison had been a seismic shift in Eleanor's world. $7 million. It was a sum so vast, so utterly removed from her lifelong perception of their finances, that it took days for her to fully comprehend its weight. But more than the money itself, it was Robert's foresight, his quiet protection, and his painful reasoning that resonated most deeply. He had seen David's trajectory, his increasing entitlement, and had made a deliberate choice to shield him from the destructive allure of easy wealth. The weeks following the wedding were a stark confirmation of Robert's fears. David and Sophia, now a united front of superficiality, continued their relentless pursuit of status. Their social media feeds, which Eleanor occasionally viewed, were a relentless parade of designer clothes, extravagant meals, and flashy new cars. They purchased a sprawling, modern house in a gated community, decorated it with ostentatious art, and hosted lavish parties, all financed by what David proudly declared was his generous inheritance. Sophia's thinly veiled disdain for Eleanor became more overt. She rarely called, and when she did, it was usually to complain about some minor inconvenience or to subtly boast about a new acquisition. "Oh, Eleanor," Sophia would sigh over the phone, "you simply must come see our new master bath. It's truly a sanctuary. I'm sure it's a far cry from your quaint bathroom, but it's simply divine." David, when he bothered to call, was no better. He was consumed by a new business venture, a high-risk tech startup that he believed would make him a billionaire overnight. He spoke of disrupting the market and leveraging networks, all buzzwords that sounded hollow to Eleanor's ears. He rarely asked about her, never truly listened to her quiet advice. He was too busy chasing his own gilded dreams. Eleanor, however, was quietly, methodically putting her own affairs in order. She met with Mr. Harrison again, not to discuss her newfound wealth, but to understand the intricacies of trusts, foundations, and philanthropic giving. Robert's will had given her complete discretion, and she intended to use it wisely, as he would have wished. She also confided in her daughter, Sarah. Sarah, 5 years younger than David, was everything David was not. Kind, compassionate, grounded. A veterinarian, she lived a modest life, devoted to her animals and her family. Eleanor invited Sarah over for a quiet dinner. Over a simple home-cooked meal, she told her daughter everything. The truth about Robert's fortune, his reasons for keeping it secret, David's true inheritance, and the hidden letter. Sarah listened, her eyes widening in shock, then filling with tears. "Dad, he did all that for us? For you, Mom? And for David?" Her voice was thick with emotion. "He really understood David, didn't he? More than we ever realized." "He did," Eleanor confirmed, a quiet sadness in her voice. "He tried to teach David, to make him value things, but David was too focused on flash. And Sophia," Sarah added, her jaw tightening. "She's only after the money, isn't she? Dad must have seen that too." "He saw it all, honey," Eleanor said, a hint of steel in her voice. "And he protected us, quietly, brilliantly. Now, it's my turn to protect his legacy, and perhaps to show David what true wealth really means." Eleanor began her plan, quietly at first. She transferred a significant sum from Robert's hidden accounts into a discreet, well-managed trust. She researched charities, foundations dedicated to education, animal welfare, a nod to Sarah, and medical research, causes Robert had quietly supported throughout his life, though on a much smaller scale. She started small. An anonymous donation to the local animal shelter, a scholarship fund for underprivileged students in Robert's name, administered through a local community college. She made no public announcements, seeking no recognition. It was a private act of remembrance, a quiet fulfillment of Robert's wishes. Meanwhile, David's new tech venture, built on bravado and an inflated sense of self-worth, began to falter. The market shifted, investors pulled out, and David, with his lack of genuine business acumen and his penchant for reckless spending, found himself in deep financial trouble. The lavish house became a burden, the designer clothes a mockery. Eleanor watched, sadly, but not without a touch of grim satisfaction. It was the lesson Robert had tried to teach him, delivered by life itself. Soon, she knew, they would come to her. The gilded cage David had built for himself was about to crumble, and when it did, Eleanor would be ready, not with a hand to pull them out, but with a quiet, powerful truth that had been hidden for too long. Chapter 4. The crumbling facade. The calls began subtly at first. David complaining about the market downturn. Sophia whining about unexpected capital calls from David's business partners. Then the thinly veiled requests for advice. Eleanor listened patiently, offering generic platitudes about perseverance and careful planning. She knew what they wanted. They wanted money. They had always believed she had a modest inheritance. A small nest egg for Robert that she was simply hoarding. Their situation deteriorated rapidly. David's startup imploded, leaving a trail of debt and disgruntled investors. The lavish house became a symbol of their financial ruin, its sprawling rooms echoing with their recriminations. Sophia, furious, accused David of incompetence. David, equally furious, blamed everyone but himself. Then came the desperate phone call. David, his voice tight with desperation, almost pleading, "Mom, we're in a real bind. The house, we might lose it. Sophia's family won't help. We thought maybe Dad left you something, some liquid assets, just a small loan, Mom, to tide us over. We'll pay you back, I swear." Eleanor's heart ached, not for their financial plight, but for the blindness of their self-interest. They still saw her as a source of money, not a source of wisdom or love. "David," Eleanor said, her voice calm, "you know your father always taught us to live within our means, to save for a rainy day. I have some savings, yes, a modest amount, enough to keep me comfortable in my retirement, but not enough to bail you out of a venture that was built on shaky ground." Sophia on speakerphone interjected, her voice sharp with disbelief. "Modest, Eleanor? Robert was a successful engineer. He must have left you more than that. You're just holding out on us, aren't you? You never understood how to live a little." "Sophia," Eleanor said, her voice gaining a surprising edge, "your father-in-law knew exactly how to live, and how to live wisely." She offered them a sum, a truly modest sum, enough to cover a few months' rent in a smaller apartment, perhaps. "This is all I can offer, David," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "And perhaps it's an opportunity for you both to learn the value of hard work, of living honestly, and building something from the ground up, not just from inherited wealth." David exploded. "You're offering us peanuts, Mom? After all Dad did? After all the money he had? You're just being spiteful. You're old-fashioned." "You don't understand modern business. We don't need your charity." Sophia's voice was equally venomous. "This is precisely why David's father didn't leave you more, Eleanor. You have no ambition, no vision. You'd just let it rot in a bank account. David, let's hang up. She's useless." They hung up, leaving Eleanor alone with the silent hum of the phone. A profound sadness settled over her, but it was tinged with a quiet determination. They had chosen their path, and now she would choose hers. Eleanor continued to work with Mr. Harrison, discreetly and efficiently. The funds from Robert's trust began to flow, not into her personal accounts for lavish spending, but into the philanthropic ventures she had meticulously chosen. A new wing of the local children's hospital was announced, a generous donation from the Robert and Eleanor Miller Charitable Foundation. A significant endowment was made to the engineering department of Robert's alma mater, creating scholarships for aspiring students. A state-of-the-art animal sanctuary broke ground, funded entirely by a private benefactor. The local newspapers, initially perplexed by the sudden influx of anonymous generosity, began to dig. The story of the mysterious Arizona philanthropist soon became a local sensation. Reporters, tenacious and curious, eventually uncovered the truth. One morning, as Eleanor sat drinking her tea, she opened the Arizona Republic. The headline blared, bold and undeniable. Quiet widow reveals $7 million fortune, funds major Arizona philanthropy. Beneath it was a photograph of Eleanor, a recent one taken at a small, private groundbreaking ceremony for the Anime Sanctuary. She was smiling, genuinely, contentedly, standing next to Sarah, who beamed with pride. The article detailed the new foundation, the hospital wing, the scholarships, the animal sanctuary, all bearing the Miller name, but conspicuously linked to Eleanor's vision, not David's. Eleanor lowered the newspaper, a sense of quiet triumph washing over her. The truth was out, not through a bitter argument or a public shaming, but through an act of profound, selfless generosity. David and Sophia, consumed by their own financial crisis, would read this. They would see it, and they would finally understand, in the most devastating way possible, the true extent of Robert's legacy and the wisdom of his quiet vengeance. The facade of their gilded lives had crumbled, and the true fortune held in Eleanor's steady hands was now unveiled for all to see. Chapter 5. The Reckoning. The phone call from David came barely an hour after the morning papers hit the stands. His voice was a raw mixture of shock, fury, and incredulity. "Mom, what is this? $7 million? You had $7 million and you didn't tell me? You let me lose everything? You let us struggle?" His voice was high-pitched, almost hysterical. "How could you do this? That was Dad's money. It was our money." Sophia, predictably, was on speakerphone again, her voice a shrill shriek. "You conniving old woman, you let us wallow in debt while you sat on a fortune? This is despicable. This is outright fraud. We'll sue you, Eleanor. We'll take every last cent." Eleanor remained calm, her voice a steady anchor in their storm of outrage. "David, Sophia, I suggest you come over. We need to talk, properly." They arrived an hour later, their faces pale, their eyes blazing with a desperate, vengeful anger. The expensive clothes they still wore now seemed tragically out of place, a final, flimsy shroud over their ruin. They burst into her living room, Sophia immediately launching into a tirade. "How dare you, Eleanor? How dare you betray us like this? All those years of Dad's money hidden away, while we struggled, while David's business collapsed." Eleanor held up a hand, silencing her. Her voice, though quiet, resonated with an authority that surprised them both. "Sit down. Both of you." Reluctantly, they sank onto the sofa, their posture stiff, their anger barely contained. "Now," Eleanor began, her gaze steady, "let me explain everything." She told them about Robert's past, about his devastating betrayal by his partners, about his vow to rebuild his fortune secretly to protect his family. She explained his profound fear that inherited wealth would corrupt David, that it would attract the wrong kind of people and destroy his character. "He wanted you, David," Eleanor said, her voice filled with a quiet sorrow, "to learn the value of hard work, of building something of your own. He didn't want you to be consumed by greed or to attract those who only sought your money. He wanted you to be a good man, not just a rich one." She then produced Robert's final letter, the one Mr. Harrison had given her. She read aloud the passages where Robert explained his motivations, his decision to leave the bulk of his fortune to Eleanor, trusting her to use it wisely, for good. As Eleanor read, David's face slowly crumpled. The anger drained away, replaced by a dawning, terrible understanding. He remembered his father's quiet admonitions, his attempts to teach him responsibility. He remembered his own dismissive laughter, his certainty that he knew better. He saw now, with horrifying clarity, the depth of his father's love and the profound wisdom he had ignored. Sophia, however, remained unmoved by the emotional revelation. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked. "A letter? This is all just a convenient excuse. It's our money, Eleanor. You have no right to give it away to hospitals and dog shelters. David, tell her." David didn't respond. He sat staring blankly ahead, the weight of his father's unspoken truth crushing him. Eleanor turned to Sophia, her eyes cold. "Sophia, your disdain for a simple life, your relentless pursuit of material wealth. Robert saw it, and he protected his legacy from it. This money was never intended for lavish parties or designer clothes or risky ventures built on nothing but arrogance. It was meant to do good. It was meant to help others. It was meant to heal," she continued, her voice gaining strength. Robert wanted David to learn resilience, humility, and the true value of character over currency. He hoped that by limiting David's initial inheritance, he would be forced to develop those qualities. But you both chose a different path. You chose greed. You chose superficiality. And now you face the consequences of those choices. Eleanor stood, walking over to the window, looking out at her modest garden. "The money is not yours to claim. It is in a charitable trust overseen by Mr. Harrison and myself. It is funding hospitals, scholarships, and animal shelters. It is doing what Robert truly intended it to do, changing lives for the better, not for the worse." She turned back to them, her gaze firm. "I am not here to bail you out. I am here to fulfill Robert's wishes. You have nothing left to claim from me or from his fortune. You must now build your lives yourselves, on the strength of your own characters, your own hard work. That is the true inheritance Robert wanted for you, David." Sophia sprang to her feet, her face contorted in a mask of fury. "This isn't over, Eleanor. You'll regret this." She stormed out, slamming the front door behind her. David remained, slumped on the sofa, his head in his hands. Dad tried to warn me," he mumbled, his voice broken. "I was so stupid, so arrogant." Eleanor walked over to him, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Your father loved you, David. He only wanted what was best for you. Perhaps now you can finally understand that." David looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. He said nothing, simply nodded slowly. He left shortly after, a defeated man, carrying the crushing weight of his own wasted opportunities and his father's unheeded wisdom. Eleanor watched him go, a profound weariness settling over her, but also a quiet sense of triumph. The battle was over. She had completed Robert's final wishes. She had protected his legacy, honored his foresight, and exposed the hollow foundations of David and Sophia's lives. Chapter 6: A Legacy Forged in Wisdom. The fallout from the public revelation of Eleanor's fortune and her philanthropic endeavors was swift and widespread. The local news continued to feature stories about the Robert and Eleanor Miller Charitable Foundation, praising Eleanor's quiet generosity and Robert's incredible foresight. David and Sophia, stripped of their illusions of inherited wealth, found themselves ostracized by their superficial social circle, their former friends avoiding them like a financial plague. Their gilded cage had shattered, leaving them with nothing but their own resentment and the harsh reality of rebuilding from scratch. Eleanor, meanwhile, found a profound sense of purpose and peace. She continued to live in her modest home, her daily routines largely unchanged. The $7 million, or rather, the fruit of Robert's meticulous planning, was now entirely dedicated to the foundation. She spent her days meeting with Mr. Harrison, overseeing the various projects and ensuring Robert's vision to use wealth for genuine good was meticulously executed. The children's hospital wing was completed, a bright, modern space bringing comfort to countless families. Scholarships enabled bright, deserving students to pursue their dreams in engineering. The animal sanctuary flourished, providing a safe haven for countless creatures. Each act of generosity, each life touched, was a silent testament to Robert's wisdom and Eleanor's unwavering commitment. Her relationship with Sarah deepened immeasurably. Sarah, who had always embodied the values of kindness and empathy, became an integral part of the Foundation's work, particularly with the animal sanctuary. She understood her mother's strength, her quiet resilience, and her profound love for Robert's memory. Their bond, forged in shared grief and newfound purpose, was unbreakable. As for David and Sophia, their path was a difficult one. Stripped of their inherited comforts and their social standing, they were forced to confront the true meaning of hard work. The luxurious home was foreclosed upon. Sophia, unable to endure the perceived indignity of a simpler life, eventually left David, returning to her family, who reluctantly took her in, though her reputation for extravagance and poor judgment followed her like a shadow. David, left alone, humbled and facing immense debt, had no choice but to start over. He took a basic, entry-level job, a far cry from his grand entrepreneurial dreams. Eleanor heard sporadic updates through Sarah, who occasionally ran into mutual acquaintances. David was struggling, working long hours, learning the hard way what it meant to earn $1. Eleanor felt a mix of sadness and a quiet hope. It was a painful lesson, but perhaps, finally, the one Robert had always intended for him. There was no joy in David's suffering, only the quiet satisfaction that Robert's legacy was being fulfilled, albeit in a way no parent ever wishes for their child. Months turned into a year. Eleanor continued her philanthropic work, her name becoming synonymous with quiet generosity in Arizona. She received letters of thanks from grateful families, from students whose lives were transformed, from animal lovers witnessing the sanctuary's impact. These were the true treasures, far more valuable than any bank statement. One quiet afternoon, almost 2 years after Robert's passing, Eleanor was sitting in her garden, reading a book. Her phone chimed. It was a text message from David. "Mom," it read, "I got a promotion today. It's not much, but it's honest work. I just wanted to tell you, and thank you, for everything. I think I finally understand." Eleanor's heart swelled. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. But this time, it was a tear of pure, unadulterated joy. It wasn't a request for money, not a complaint, not a demand. It was an acknowledgement, a sign that perhaps, finally, Robert's most profound wish had been realized, that his son was learning, that the lesson, though hard-won, was taking root. She closed her eyes, picturing Robert's kind, wise face. He hadn't hidden his fortune out of malice or eccentricity. He had hidden it out of a deep, abiding love, a love that sought to protect his family, not just from poverty, but from the corrupting influence of easy wealth. Eleanor had been the quiet guardian of that legacy, the silent executor of his wise, if painful, plan. Her life was filled with purpose, her days rich with meaning. She had reclaimed her power, not by displaying wealth, but by channeling it into kindness and genuine impact. She understood now that true strength lay not in what one possessed, but in how one chose to wield it. And in that quiet Arizona afternoon, Eleanor felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that Robert's foresight, his sacrifice, had not been in vain. The fortune had been unveiled, not as a weapon, but as a beacon of hope, proving that true wealth, indeed, lay not in the millions, but in the enduring values of character, resilience, and the quiet, unwavering power of a mother's love.